Alright guys, so let's talk about the G7 and the big panic going on. The economic war is escalating, and without a doubt, the biggest risk today centers around the confiscation of the Russian assets. We mentioned before how the US would give Ukraine $61 billion, and they did. In the same vein, we believe the $300 billion that's frozen is effectively gone. The US really wants to confiscate it for Ukraine.
My European colleagues have now taken an important first step to harness windfall proceeds from Russian sovereign actions. That's an action I fully endorse. I also believe it's necessary and urgent for our coalition to find a way to unlock the value of these immobilized assets to support Ukraine's continued resistance and long-term reconstruction.
Now, taking the assets is very easy, but the G7 will need to prepare for the blowback effects. Russia isn't going to sit back and stay idle. Moscow has demonstrated time and time again they are willing to fight fire with fire. They have frozen assets from EU banks and confiscated land just a month ago. The long-term effects will be disastrous. The euro will be in danger and de-dollarization will get even worse. But so are the short-term risks. Putin has laid out a plan to target private US assets, not just any property belonging to the US government, but anything from American companies and individuals. His decree states that the following can be seized: securities and stakes in Russian companies, real estate and movable property like cash are also liable for seizure. If Yellen decides to use the Russian assets or the profits, Putin will likely enforce the decree. He'll counter-confiscate the assets as compensation. And it's quite hard to track how much Western money is trapped in Russia. It's even harder to pinpoint the amount of US assets available for Putin to seize. But we do have an idea, and it's not a small amount. This list is from Reuters. It's from 2 years back, but it does give us a rough gauge of Western exposure in Russia. Just in Western banks alone, we have $120 billion of assets stranded in Russia, of which nearly 15 billion belongs to US banks including Citigroup and Goldman Sachs. If the G7 goes through with their confiscation, all these assets are at risk of seizure as well. This will be a horrific tit-for-tat punishment that Russia could inflict. They have done it before, and it will just be another Tuesday for them. US banks might have stopped operations, but the money is still stuck in Russia. Putin can simply reach in and take the money whenever he likes. Citigroup, for example, still has $7 billion tied to the country. The funds are sitting in the Russian central bank and other Russian institutions. There's no exit without a permit from Putin. And in total, Russia claims there's around $290 billion in Western assets they can seize. And if that is true, that will match the G7 confiscation. Now, that's just the immediate danger. What's more important is the years and decades ahead. And let's assume the best case scenario, that the confiscation goes off without a hitch and that Russia somehow doesn't retaliate. It still doesn't solve the long-term problem. You still have to borrow more money to fund Ukraine later on. The $300 billion is finite and the funds will be depleted sooner or later. And when that happens, we'll get a repeat of this again.
It's as if no one has noticed that we have no extra money to send to Ukraine. Our deficit this year will exceed $1.5 trillion. Borrowing money from China to send it to Ukraine makes no sense. It's not as if we have some sort of rainy day fund sitting around, trillions of dollars in a pot of money, and we're just going to send that to Ukraine. We're going to borrow it. When we borrow it and create new money to pay for that borrowing, we create the inflation that is plaguing our economy.
Now, Rand Paul is absolutely right, except it's gonna be much worse. If you confiscate Russia's money, what are the odds of China buying US bonds to help Biden fund Ukraine again? It would be slim to none, and Slim just left the building. China is in fact pulling away their assets, their investments in dollars. Not only did they sell 53 billion in US bonds held in the US, but they are doing it in Europe as well. Belgium, which is a custodian of Chinese money, sold off $22 billion worth of US debt. It's true that China likely took a big loss dumping the bonds, but losing 20 cents on the dollar is better than losing everything. A 20% loss beats total seizure. By confiscating the Russian assets, you are threatening to break your very own financial system. Destroying a $27 trillion market for a measly $300 billion sounds like a horrible idea. It's important that we look at the amount of debt issuance from Janet Yellen. The amount borrowed is getting progressively worse. In April last year, she issued over $1 trillion worth of bonds. Just last month, the amount broke past $2.5 trillion. The last thing you want is to borrow at higher interest rates. What's terrifying is how close we are to confiscation. For many months, Germany was holding out. They were highly resistant to the US plan because they kind of knew the risk, but the last holdout is about to end. There's big speculation that Germany is warming up to the idea. At the G7 summit in June, we could get a watershed moment from Olaf Scholz, an agreement to use the reserves. If or when that happens, the US might be able to raise $50 billion more to lend to Ukraine. The loan, of course, will be backed by the frozen assets as collateral. So if Ukraine defaults, Russian assets will be seized to pay back the G7 lenders. Obviously, this will be a horrendous decision. It will open the biggest Pandora box the financial world has ever seen. Now, that's just on the Russian side, right? But let's shift gears to China because the G7 meeting also revolves around, guess what, containing Beijing. Once again, Yellen is trying to rally the G7 for coordinated action against Beijing. She wants to create a great wall of opposition to battle China's excess capacity. Basically, she wants to gather the Fellowship of the Ring, 7 members of the West, to counter the growing threat of China's industries. China's chip manufacturing is freaking them out.
This is not a bilateral issue between the US and China. German Chancellor Scholz raised this issue in his April trip to China, and President Macron and President von der Leyen emphasized the need for balanced trade relations with China earlier this month. The G7 has collectively recognized the need to protect our workers and businesses from unfair practices, and overcapacity threatens the viability of firms around the world.
And this is where things get really interesting. Europe is going to be the great balancing power here. If they side with the US, we can expect a bigger trade war. Biden's set of tariffs is just going to be the start. There's an idea that China is flooding Europe with a ton of cheap goods, especially in renewable energy, and on the surface, it does look rather concerning. China is exporting a ton of lithium ion batteries and solar panels to Europe. Sales have gone up in both categories by at least 5 times over the past 4 years. You can say there's a flood of Chinese exports into the market, but let's not forget what these are. These are inputs into the European industry itself. Lithium ion batteries, for example, are essential components for EVs. If the EU were to make it themselves, the cost of cars would go up. The end product will be less competitive. Prices will go up on EU-made cars across the board. They will lose even more ground to Chinese automakers on the world stage. And it's the same situation for solar panels in the EU. Cheap solar panels are an asset for Europe. And as we all know, the EU has an energy crisis. They don't have access to cheap Russian gas anymore. Finding cheaper alternatives is extremely important. Cheap and plentiful energy will help EU industries recover and compete again. Within China, solar companies are having a price war. As a result, the price of solar panels has totally collapsed. It has gone from 25 cents per watt to nearly just 10 cents. That's a 60% crash in prices. This is only going to benefit EU companies that need energy. And these are the advantages Europe has with Chinese goods. There's a reason why 90% of solar panels installed in Europe today are Chinese. It's because the economics simply make sense. It's cost effective to do so. And these are the considerations Europe has to remember. Siding with the US is really easy to do, but the economic damage could be very severe. The problem with containing China is how things can truly backfire. America's approach is outdated and is only going to piss China off even more.
Senator, we've tried it both ways. We've had these conversations with China from some time in private, hoping to see a change. We haven't seen that, and it's important.
I would argue
call
that
them out.
I would argue that we've only tried it one way. We've got the stick, and almost the majority of people who work for you, everybody wants to use the stick. Nobody's really considering that there is a carrot. So really, for the last, let's say, 5 years or more, your administration, the previous administration, not a lot different, really, that you put impediments to trade, you add sanctions, and then you scold them. And I mean, there is a school of philosophy or school of diplomacy that believes that public scolding, particularly in another country, can have the opposite effects. That actually you've either completely given up on this, nothing's working, so why don't we just read them the riot act? And that's kind of what it looked like.
Scolding China isn't going to work, and let's not forget the Chinese response. They can always raise import taxes on Western goods as well. But the biggest move China can make is to double down on growing their own economy, which is exactly what Beijing is doing. Developing their industrial base is just step one. They are now moving to grow domestic consumption, and to do this, China is raising a ton of money for stimulus. The first batch of bonds sold raised 40 billion yuan. And here's the important part: there are 4 times more demand than supply in the debt auction. In other words, investors believe in the China story, so they are rushing to buy the bonds. China's strategy is rather simple. They are going to bolster the property sector to prevent a collapse. The idea is to rebuild consumer demand and boost retail growth. And if the West starts decoupling their markets from Beijing, you need to mobilize domestic consumption to compensate. Just in case the US and the EU markets shut you away, you can rely on your own people. And when it comes to raising money or debt issuance, China has a very big advantage. Unlike the US, bond yields in China are dropping, the cost of borrowing is getting cheaper, and that allows the Chinese government to borrow a ton of money without creating a big debt crisis. In a worst case scenario, they can actually outspend the West. They still have more room to maneuver. The yield on their 20-year bond is less than 2.5%. In the US, the 20-year Treasury has a yield of 4.6%, 200 basis points higher. China's cost of borrowing is significantly cheaper than the US. And here's the situation: China isn't exactly defenseless. They still have many financial tools and levers they can pull. On the flip side, just because the G7 bands together doesn't mean it's an automatic win. The Western economies have a huge consumer market, no one is denying that. But to assume weaponizing it will collapse China's economy tomorrow is a very premature victory lap. So I hope we get an understanding of the coming trade war. It's going to get ugly, it's going to get nasty. It's clear that the West can't catch up with China's industrial growth, and that's why we have claims of overcapacity. China won't give up their advantage either. They will simply build up their domestic base to replace Western demand. We'll also continue to see the G7, especially the US, weaponize everything that they can: consumer markets, currencies, and of course, supply chains. And this will eventually lead to a bigger decoupling between China and the West. But let me know what you think. Will the G7 confiscate everything? And will Europe join the US against China? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.